Audiobook title Gate of Hind Chapter 01 to 10 Part 01 Volume 1 The Gathering Storm Chapter 1 The cries on the salty wind. A single drop of blood in the ocean can summon a tempest, but it was a captive woman's solitary cry on the salty wind that ignited the wrath of an empire. The vast, untamed expanse of the Indian Ocean roared beneath a bruised and darkening sky. For the Arab merchants and their families aboard the Grand Fleet, the voyage had begun with the serene promise of a holy pilgrimage. They had set sail from the vibrant coral islands of Ceylon, their bows cutting smoothly through the azure waves, bound for the sacred journey of Hajj. The holds of these majestic vessels were heavy with more than just provisions and trade goods. They carried the extravagant homage of a king. Each year, the Rajah of Ceylon dispatched magnificent, rich gifts for Caliph Walid, the supreme ruler of the Islamic Empire who resided in distant Damascus. The ships were setting a steady course toward Basra, tracing the ancient sea lanes that Arab sailors had mastered for generations. Without warning, the skies unleashed their fury. A violent, ferocious sea storm descended upon the fleet off the jagged coast of Sind. The gale howled like a wounded beast, tearing at the sails and tossing the heavy merchant ships as though they were mere driftwood. Desperate to survive the wrath of the elements, the battered fleet was forced to alter its course and limp toward the nearest sanctuary, the formidable port of Debel. Debel was no ordinary harbour. It was a sprawling, heavily fortified stronghold that dominated the coastline. From miles out at sea, the desperate sailors could spot its defining landmark, a colossal temple featuring a spire that reached 40 yards into the heavens. High above this immense steeple, a great red flag fluttered violently in the sea breeze, an arrogant testament to the city's pride and supposed invincibility. The Arab ships, groaning under the immense stress of the storm, dropped anchor in the shadow of this towering monument, grateful merely to have survived the tempest. But the sanctuary was a trap. The sea robbers of Sind, observing the crippled vessels from the shoreline, recognized a rare and effortless prize. They saw ships sitting low in the water, their hulls bursting with the Rajah's rich cargo, more enticing to the ruthless corsairs. They noticed a significant number of women and children huddled on the decks, offering no promise of serious armed resistance. Like a pack of starving wolves descending upon a wounded stag, the marauders launched their swift, deadly attack on the helpless ships. Boarding hooks bit into the wooden rails as the sea robbers swarmed the decks, their blades flashing in the gloomy, rain-swept light. The assault was merciless and absolute. They ruthlessly looted the precious cargo and slaughtered many of the defending men, their blood mingling with the salty rain. Amidst the chaos and the dying, several terrified women and children were rounded up, taken captive to be dragged into the dark holes of the city. As iron chains were slapped roughly onto her wrists, one captive Arab woman fell to her knees on the blood-stained deck. Despair warring with defiance, she looked toward the western horizon and screamed into the howling gale. "Help! Help! Oh, Hajjaj, help!" Her voice tore through the heavy air, a desperate plea to the fearsome and uncompromising viceroy of the Calipha's eastern provinces. A pirate captain, his hands slick with stolen wealth, turned to her and sneered. "Hajjaj is too far away to hear your cries, foolish woman," he jeered, his cruel laughter cutting through the roar of the surf. He grabbed her chain, pulling her brutally toward the shore.
"Even if your words do reach him, we are out of his reach," the heartless sea robber mocked.
The pirate's laughter echoed against the stone walls of Debel, arrogant and unbothered. He did not know that across the impassable deserts the uncompromising viceroy would indeed hear of that exact plea, and he could not possibly fathom that the storm they had just survived was but a gentle breeze compared to the devastating tempest Hajjaj bin Yusuf was about to unleash upon their shores. Chapter 2 The wrath of Basra. Distance is a liar. It whispers of safety to the arrogant, while weaving a noose of vengeance for the doomed. The clash of empires is rarely sparked by a formal declaration of war, rather it is ignited by the dangerous combination of unchecked cruelty and a ruler who foolishly underestimates the reach of his enemies. The journey back from the treacherous coast of Sind was agonizing for the handful of survivors. A few men, battered and haunted by the carnage they had witnessed, had managed to escape the blood-soaked decks of the ambushed fleet. Enduring exhaustion and despair, they traversed the unforgiving maritime routes until they finally arrived at the bustling, grand city of Basra. They did not go to the merchants or the port authorities. They brought their harrowing tale directly to the pinnacle of provincial power. They were brought before Hajjaj bin Yusuf, the fearsome and uncompromising viceroy of the Calipha's eastern provinces. Hajjaj was a man of iron will, renowned for his ruthless firmness and his absolute intolerance for anyone who disturbed the peace of his lands. The survivors knelt before his imposing figure and delivered their tragic news. With trembling voices, they recounted the ferocious sea storm that had crippled their ships and the merciless ambush by the sea robbers of Sind. They described the looted cargo and the slaughter of their fellow men. Most harrowing of all, they reported that several women and children had been dragged away as prisoners. The men relayed the exact, words of a captive, helpless Arab woman who had desperately cried out, "Help!
Help! O Hajjaj, help!"
To compound the insult, they recounted the pirates' cruel mockery, how the thieves had jeered that the viceroy was too far away to ever hear her pleas or take action. Hajjaj was not a man given to soft emotion, but the tale of the defenseless captives and the sheer audacity of the pirates struck a profound chord within him. He was deeply moved. "I must do something to help this Arab woman," he exclaimed, his voice echoing through the silent hall with the heavy weight of an unbreakable oath. Before unleashing the devastating might of his armies, Hajjaj chose the path of diplomacy. He took the matter up directly with the sovereign of the offending territory, Raja Daha. The viceroy drafted a firm, unyielding letter detailing exactly what the sea robbers of Sind had done to the Caliph's peaceful subjects. He pointedly reminded Daha that, as the ruler of Sind, it was his inherent duty to deal with these robbers and to secure the immediate release of the captive Arab women and children. Furthermore, Hajjaj's letter demanded that Daha make good the heavy financial losses the Arabs had suffered. The diplomatic missive crossed the vast, sun-baked expanses to Sind, but it was received with scorn rather than caution. Upon reading the viceroy's demands, Daha did not take the letter very seriously. Blinded by overconfidence and surrounded by his massive armies, the Raja believed himself to be untouchable. He reasoned that Hajjaj was simply too far away, separated from his kingdom by an impassable desert. Convinced he could easily brush the viceroy off without consequence, Daha drafted a careless and arrogant reply. "I am helpless in the matter," the Raja wrote dismissively. "You're free to deal with the robbers as you think fit." When Daha's response arrived in Basra, it did not end the matter, it poured oil upon a simmering fire. The Hindu Raja had mistakenly believed that his flippant reply would close the book on the incident. Little did he know that he had unwittingly angered a man who never made compromises with his enemies and utterly despised half measures. For Hajjaj, the crisis had escalated far beyond a simple rescue mission. It was now a dire threat to the survival and prosperity of his civilization. The greatness of the Arab people was inextricably tied to their mastery of the seas, and those vital sea lanes had to be kept safe for trade. If Debel was permitted to remain a danger spot, it would mean the collapse of Arab trade in the east, an outcome that would shake the very foundations of Arab greatness. Hajjaj's fury fully ignited. He was determined to fight this maritime danger, and the ultimate price of that fight did not matter. He immediately wrote to Caliph Walid in Damascus, explicitly detailing the atrocity that had occurred at Debel and requesting royal permission to send a military expedition to Sind. The Caliph understood that such an undertaking would be incredibly costly, but the honor of Islam and the safety of his people were directly at stake. With the Caliph's blessing secured, the die was cast. Daha had arrogantly told Hajjaj to deal with the robbers himself. Now the unyielding viceroy of Basra was prepared to do exactly that, and he would bring the full, crushing weight of an empire down upon the shores of Sind to do it. The cries on the salty wind had been heard, and the storm of retribution was finally breaking. Chapter 3: The crushed vanguards. The desert swallows armies as easily as the ocean swallows ships, but it is the unchecked arrogance of kings that truly drowns an empire. Though the initial Arab vanguards were shattered by overwhelming numbers and monstrous beasts, their tragic defeats did not end the war. Instead, they forged an unbreakable resolve in the heart of Basra's fiercest warlord. And with righteous fury, Caliph Walid allowed his viceroy at Basra to take direct action against the sea robbers of Debel. The first Arab expedition to answer this call marched under the command of Ubaydullah. Passing through the rugged, unforgiving terrain of Mekran, the resolute vanguard crossed the frontier and entered Sind. Raja Daha, sitting comfortably upon his throne, knew full well that this expedition had been sent not against him, but strictly against the pirates on whom he himself could not lay hands. Yet, driven by an inflated sense of invincibility, Daha deliberately chose a path of confrontation.
He dispatched a massive army to beat back the advancing Arabs.
As the two forces collided on the sun-scorched plains, the brutal reality of war set in. The small Arab force was simply no match for the overwhelming size of the army of Daha. Surrounded and fighting with desperate valor, Ubaydullah fell in battle, and most of his men perished alongside him. The first expedition failed in a tragic baptism of blood. However, the agonizing news of this slaughter did not break the spirit of Basra. Hajjaj was entirely undaunted by the loss. Refusing to let the blood of his countrymen stain the sands unavenged, he swiftly fitted out another expedition, this time under the command of Budel. Learning from the grim fate of the first wave, the Arabs were thoroughly prepared to face the Hindu army head-on. Budel, a famously fearless general, ordered the charge, and his men put up an incredibly tough fight against Daha's sweeping forces. The clash of steel and the roar of battle echoed across the plains as the second vanguard threatened to break the Hindu lines. But to Budel's dismay, a great and terrifying surprise was in store for him on the battlefield. The earth began to tremble, signaling the arrival of a weapon the Arab cavalry had never encountered.
Daha unleashed his behemoths, towering Indian elephants draped in thick armor and driven by fierce mahouts.
At the sight of these monstrous bellowing beasts, the Arab horses instantly became unmanageable.
Panic ripped through the cavalry ranks. The highly trained steeds bucked and reared, their eyes wide with primeval terror.
Budel's own horse got terribly frightened in the chaotic shadow of the advancing Titans.
In a violent frenzy, the frantic animal bucked violently and threw Budel down to the trampled earth.
Before he could recover his footing, the Arab commander was slain.
Stripped of their fearless leader and utterly unable to control their terrified mounts, his surviving men had no choice but to break formation and fall back to Meccan.
The second expedition had been crushed beneath the heavy feet of Daha's war beasts.
In the opulent halls of his fortress,
Daha celebrated. The twin victories inflated his ego to dangerous proportions, cementing his belief that he was too powerful to care for the friendship of his Muslim neighbors.
He believed he had broken the will of the invaders.
He was gravely mistaken. The two consecutive defeats in Sind had little effect on Hajjaj's iron determination. If anything, the catastrophic losses only made his resolve all the more strong.
Daha had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of his enemy.
Hajjaj was a man who never made a compromise with his enemies, nor did he ever believe in half measures.
The Raja of Sind had unwittingly angered a relentless force of nature.
By slaughtering the vanguards and celebrating his hollow triumphs, Daha had chosen to cross swords with a man who would give him absolutely no quarter.
The vanguards were crushed, but the true storm was only just beginning to gather.
Chapter 4. The boy commander of Islam. True authority is not measured by the grey in a man's beard, but by the iron in his spine and the unshakable fire in his soul.
When the towering ambitions of arrogant kings threaten the peace of an empire, destiny often chooses the most unlikely vessels to deliver its crushing judgment. In the wake of two devastating defeats, a grim realization settled over the halls of Basra. The tragic failures of the previous vanguards made it absolutely certain that the preparation of a third expedition needed far greater attention and unyielding thoroughness. For Hajjaj bin Yusuf, the stakes had transcended mere retribution. The third campaign had to succeed without question. On its final outcome hung the future of Arab sea trade, as well as Hajjaj's own personal honor. He had personally sought the Caliph's permission to punish the enemies of Islam, yet those enemies were still arrogantly at large, all while the Caliph's treasury had borne the heavy expenses of the two failed expeditions. Knowing that police action against Daha needed careful thought and meticulous preparation, Hajjaj decided to give personal attention to every detail of the third expedition. He was the most feared man of his time, a leader fiercely known for his uncompromising firmness and exhaustive thoroughness. The very first and most critical task that faced Hajjaj was the choice of a capable general, especially since two seasoned commanders had already fallen to the enemy's might. He needed a military genius, someone whose tactical brilliance was matched only by their absolute fearlessness. At last, scanning the vast ranks of the empire's leaders, Hajjaj's choice fell upon his youthful nephew Muhammad bin Qasim. Muhammad, who was also the viceroy's son-in-law, was barely 17 years old, yet he was already serving as the governor of Ray in Persia. The choice might have seemed like madness to the uninitiated, but Hajjaj saw what others could not. From early boyhood, Muhammad had given a distinct promise of rare ability as a leader of men. Hajjaj had witnessed ample proof of this exceptional capability in the masterful way the youthful Muhammad had managed administrative and military matters at Ray. Looking across his vast territories, Hajjaj could find no better man to lead his army to Sind. Critics might whisper that he would merely make a boy commander, but Hajjaj knew his history. There had been boy commanders in Islam before, most notably Usama bin Zayd R.A. He was a boy commander appointed by the Messenger of Allah himself. With that divine precedent lighting his path, Hajjaj finally made up his mind to put his youthful son-in-law in supreme command. Far away in the mountains of Persia, Muhammad received the heavy orders to get ready for his new responsibility.
The task laid before him was staggeringly difficult, enough to unnerve even a tried general.
The young prodigy had to march his forces into the strange, uncharted land of the Hindus, crossing wide, unforgiving desert tracts. He was commanded to fight a massive enemy that had been made overbold by two easy victories. Furthermore, he was to campaign among an alien people with whom he had nothing in common, fully aware that his handful of men could be easily overwhelmed by the sheer weight of numbers.
These monumental considerations would have shattered a lesser man, but Muhammad was made of something profoundly different.
He possessed an aura of icy calm. He was as cool and prudent in dealing with men as he was entirely fearless in the chaos of battle. For a spirit forged by unwavering faith, no task could be too difficult for him. With calm confidence, the 17-year-old visionary efficiently made overcharge of his duties at Ray and set off to Shiraz. It was there, beneath the Persian sun, that he was to formally join his army. As he rode into the military encampment, the elite forces of the Caliph looked upon their new leader. They saw not a boy, but a soaring eagle ready to strike. The youthful commander of Islam was on his way to Sind, stepping seamlessly into the legendary boots of those who came before him, prepared to bring a defiant king to his knees. Chapter 5. Forging the Iron Vanguard. Battles are decided in the chaotic frenzy of the vanguard, but empires are built on the cold, calculating logistics of preparation.
Hajjaj bin Yusuf, the uncompromising architect of this impending storm, was determined to leave absolutely nothing to chance.
He knew that the unforgiving deserts and fortified walls of Sind would swallow an unprepared army, so he meticulously forged a military machine the likes of which the eastern frontiers had never seen. In the sun-baked encampments of Shiraz, the young prodigy Muhammad bin Qasim arrived to take the reins of this staggering force.
To ensure absolute victory, Hajjaj had placed under Muhammad's supreme command the very best of the armies of the Caliphate.
The sheer scale of the assembled host was awe-inspiring. The arid ground trembled beneath the hooves of 6,000 elite Syrian horses, a devastating cavalry matched in scale by a formidable camel corps of equal strength. Trailing behind this vanguard was a massive, highly organized supply train composed of 3,000 camels, dedicated entirely to carrying the baggage and lifeblood of the troops. This extensive baggage train contained everything that the men were likely to need during their grueling campaign in an alien land. The Viceroy's tactical brilliance extended far beyond the accumulation of weapons and armor. He possessed an almost obsessive foresight regarding his soldiers' morale and physical well-being. He knew that the Arab troops were particularly fond of vinegar, a cultural staple that provided both comfort and essential sustenance. However, Hajjaj was acutely aware that this precious commodity could not be easily hid in the distant territories of Sind. To solve this logistical nightmare, Hajjaj engineered a brilliant innovation. He ordered his quartermasters to soak massive quantities of cotton wool flakes in pure vinegar and then had them thoroughly dried in the scorching sun. Once on the campaign trail, when these infused flakes were again soaked in warm water, they would perfectly reconstitute to supply the troops with their cherished vinegar. In short, the fearsome viceroy tried to anticipate and provide for even the smallest, most specific needs of his fighting men, ensuring their spirits remained unbroken. With the land forces fully equipped and their supply chains ingeniously secured, Muhammad turned his attention to the looming threat of Daha's walled fortresses. Knowing that the grueling march through Mecca would drain his men, Muhammad made a pivotal strategic decision. At Shiraz, he decided to send his heavy artillery separately by sea.
This formidable naval arsenal was not composed of mere catapults.
The fleet carried a terrifying, colossal manjnik famously known as the Aras or the Bride. Because gunpowder was entirely unknown in those ancient days, the heavy artillery of the era was made up of these massive manjniks, gigantic engineered wooden cannons designed to hurl crushing pieces of solid stone at the enemy fortifications. The Aras was a siege engine of such unprecedented nightmarish proportions that an astonishing 500 men were needed simply to work its heavy winches and levers. As the great ships weighed anchor, laden with the timber and iron capable of shattering the sky, the young boy commander watched the sails catch the wind. The board was meticulously set, the pieces were in motion, and the Iron Vanguard was primed. Total war was no longer a distant, whispered threat, it was a rapidly approaching tide, bringing with it a monstrous bride of destruction to the shores of Sind. Chapter 6. Arrival at the impenetrable fortress. A fortress is only as impenetrable as the faith of those guarding it, and marching over the horizon was a tempest whose faith could shatter solid stone. It began as a deceptively quiet day in the autumn of 711 AD. The coastal seaport of Debel hummed with the busy, rhythmic activity of a thriving maritime metropolis. Yet beneath the veneer of bustling commerce lay the grim, undeniable reality of a heavily militarized stronghold. A strong, unyielding stone wall protected the city on all sides, wrapping the town in an impenetrable defensive embrace. Pacing these formidable battlements was an elite armed force of 4,000 fierce Rajputs, their weapons gleaming in the mild autumn sun, standing ready to guard the town against any interloper foolish enough to approach. Rising from the very heart of the fortress was a structure that seemed to challenge the heavens themselves.
In the middle of the town stood an ancient, colossal idol temple serving as the spiritual and cultural epicenter of Debel.
No fewer than 3,000 shaven Brahmins resided within its vast, echoing halls, dedicating their lives to serving the temple and catering to its idols.
But it was the temple's architectural crown that truly dominated the skyline, a breathtaking steeple towering 40 yards high into the air.
Down to the absolute peak of this spire was a great red flag, snapping proudly in the sea breeze, casting a long, arrogant shadow over the city as a symbol of divine protection and unshakable defiance. It was before this proudly defiant city that the youthful Arab commander Muhammad bin Qasim finally appeared. He and his Iron Vanguard emerged from the dusty horizon after enduring a long and weary march across harsh, unforgiving landscapes. Dust-covered but unbroken, the Arab cavalry brought their mounts to a halt,
their eyes fixed on the monolithic walls and the towering red banner that seemed to mock them from the clouds.
Yet, the boy commander was not relying solely on his exhausted cavalry.
A shadow fell over the glittering waters of the harbour.
Looking toward the coast, Muhammad found his devastating heavy artillery already waiting for him at the port.
The formidable naval fleet,
Meticulously dispatched by Hajjaj,
had successfully reached Debel before the land army even arrived. The cowardly sea robbers, the very pirates whose cruelty had ignited this total war, had found the Arab fleet far too strong to resist. In their terror, they had abandoned the open waters and taken refuge within the supposed safety of Debel's high stone walls. With the harbour completely secured and unchallenged, the monstrous Arab artillery was safely brought on shore. Winches groaned, heavy timber struck the sand, and thick ropes were pulled taut as the engineers assembled their apocalyptic siege engines. Among them, casting a silhouette that rivaled the temple's spire, the giant manjnik known as the Aristobride was raised into position.
This colossal wooden cannon towered menacingly above all the other manjniks, an engineered beast of destruction fully assembled and ready to go into action. As the colossal Aris locked its sights on the city, the great red flag of Debel continued to flutter above the stone fortifications, unaware that its days of invincibility were numbered. The trap was set, the artillery was primed, and the quiet autumn air was about to shatter.
The ultimate siege had begun.
Chapter 7. The Talisman's secret wars of attrition are won not by the breaking of stone, but by the shattering of illusions. When impenetrable walls stall the advance of an empire, victory often lies hidden in the fragile shadows of myth and belief.
Though Debel was taken by complete surprise, the city was meticulously ready to withstand any storm.
The town was a magnificent, unyielding fortress fully protected by solid stone fortifications that seemed to laugh at the Arab weaponry. For several grueling days, the brutal siege went on with a grinding intensity. Small, daring parties of the Hindus sometimes came out from the gates, and brisk, bloody fighting took place in the dusty plains. However, the main Hindu army fiercely refused to come out for a definitive, open trial of strength. Safe behind their colossal walls, Hindu spirits remained exceptionally high.
To the weary soldiers of the Iron Vanguard, it seemed utterly impossible to take the town by storm. The defenders' unshakable confidence did not stem merely from the armed Rajput warriors pacing the battlements.
There was a deeper mystical absolute protecting the city, the god of the temple. There was little doubt in the minds of the Hindus that the idol god alone was enough to beat back any enemy attacks. Fortified with this profound spiritual belief, they had confidently shut the massive gates of the city when the Arabs first laid siege to Debel.
Muhammad bin Qasim, observing the agonizing stalemate, wanted to finish with Debel as quickly as possible, but to do so he critically needed to know the true state of things inside the fortified town. The turning point arrived not with a deafening crash of artillery, but through a quiet fracture in the enemy's resolve. Fortunately for the young commander, a disillusioned Brahmin defected from the Grand Temple. He was slipped through the siege lines and brought directly before the youthful Arab commander.
Rather than employing torture or intimidation, Muhammad approached the captive with unexpected tact and genuine kindness.
This diplomatic mercy disarmed the priest completely.
Before long, Muhammad was able to win his sympathy, and the Brahmin was ready to surrender the real, carefully guarded secret of Hindu morale.
The command tent fell into a tense, hushed silence as the defector spoke.
"You cannot take the town," the Brahmin warned, his voice heavy with superstitious dread as he gestured toward the distant, towering silhouette of the temple, "unless you do something about the talisman prepared by the Brahmins." Muhammad leaned forward, his sharp eyes narrowing in intrigue. "What talisman?"
he asked in surprise.
The Brahmin took a deep breath, revealing the magical cornerstone of the city's seemingly impenetrable defense. "Well," he went on, "you see the 40-yard-high steeple of the temple and the great red flag flying from it. You also see the thick staff of the flag." He paused, the gravity of the secret hanging heavily in the air. "At the base of this staff the Brahmins have placed a talisman.
No harm can come to the town as long as the flag is there."
The story told by the Brahmin proved to be of monumental help to
Muhammad. It instantly put the brilliant young tactician on the right track, revealing that the fortress was not defended by indestructible stone alone, but by a fragile thread of belief tied to a piece of red cloth. He now knew with absolute certainty that Hindu spirits would remain high as long as the great red flag remained intact.
Muhammad stepped out of the tent and turned his gaze toward his colossal siege engine. He knew exactly what he must do to shatter their invincible talisman.
Chapter 8. Shattering the heavens. A single strike can shatter more than solid stone. It can shatter the very soul of a city. When the myth of invincibility is exposed as a fragile illusion, the heavens themselves must fall to earth.
Armed with the defecting Brahmin's earth-shattering revelation, Muhammad bin Qasim wasted absolutely no time.
The young commander knew that attacking the heavy stone walls was useless as long as the defenders' faith remained unbroken.
Stepping out into the chaotic, wind-swept siege camp, Muhammad immediately summoned Jawriya, the battle-hardened chief of his artillery.
Pointing toward the sky, the young prodigy ordered his chief engineer to completely ignore the fortifications and make the impossibly high flagstaff his singular, absolute target.
Jowier turned his gaze upward, analyzing the terrifying 40-yard high steeple that pierced the clouds.
It was an unprecedented tactical challenge.
The chief of artillery approached the colossal arras, the towering manjanik whose shadow swallowed the surrounding siege lines. To hit a target position so high in the heavens required absolute mathematical precision and flawless execution.
Ordering his massive crew of 500 men into position, Jowier began meticulously calibrating the beast.
He critically shortened the foot of the bride so that its immense trajectory could shift from a horizontal battering ram to a vertical anti-aircraft arc perfectly angled to hit the sky-high flagstaff.
The atmosphere grew incredibly tense, the air crackling with the heavy anticipation of total war. The massive wooden winches groaned like dying leviathans as hundreds of soldiers strained against the thick ropes, pulling the giant firing arm back until the tension threatened to snap the very timber.
Release! Jowier roared over the din of battle. The first massive stone launched with a deafening boom, violently tearing through the sky, but it sailed just wide of the spire.
A second colossal payload was quickly loaded and fired, roaring through the clouds, but it merely grazed the air around the steeple. Then came the third.
Time seemed to slow to an absolute crawl as Jowier dropped his hand, releasing the heavier iron lever for the third strike. The mighty arras unleashed its fury, launching a meteor of solid stone straight into the heavens.
The massive projectile tore through the roaring wind, a dark blur of kinetic devastation arcing perfectly toward the peak of the temple. The impact was cataclysmic.
The third stone struck true, violently slamming into the towering flagstaff with the force of a thunderbolt instantly, and completely shattering its base.
An explosive shockwave of splintered wood erupted against the sky, sending shockwaves of despair rippling through the Rajput defenders.
The magical anchor of the city was obliterated, the talisman was broken, and the great red flag was no more.
Severed from its divine perch, the gargantuan red banner, the ultimate symbol of Debal's eternal defiance, plummeted dramatically to the earth.
It tumbled through the sky like a dying bird, taking the unbreakable morale and the false invincibility of the Hindu defenders down with it.
The heavens had been shattered, and the impenetrable fortress was finally exposed. Chapter 9. The Storming of Debal. When the symbols of invincibility crumble into dust, the hearts of the mortals who worship them are the next to break.
The destruction of Debal's sacred red banner proved that true conquest requires not only the breaching of physical walls, but the shattering of long-held illusions, paving the way for a shockingly unprecedented era of mercy.
For weeks, the Hindu defenders had placed the entirety of their hopes in the magical talisman, firmly believing it to be an invincible shield. When the colossal Arab siege engine obliterated the flagstaff, the destruction of the talisman struck the defenders like a devastating stroke of lightning. Staring blankly at the empty sky where their great banner once flew, the priests and warriors could hardly believe their own eyes. They had steadfastly believed their idol god to be all-powerful and their talisman to be their ultimate, unbreakable defense. But in a single catastrophic heartbeat, those absolute beliefs were shattered to pieces. To the terrified defenders, the alien invader suddenly seemed vastly more powerful than anything they had ever encountered in their history.
Utter paralyzing confusion rapidly spread throughout the sprawling town.
Driven by pure, blinding despair,
the fierce Rajputs threw open the heavy city gates, rushing out of the fortress in a wild, chaotic attack on the Arab lines. However, their frantic assault lacked discipline. The Iron Vanguard met the frenzied charge with cold, calculated steel, and the Rajputs were brutally beaten back with heavy losses.
Sensing that the enemy's spirit was definitively fractured, Mohammed bin Qasim was determined to put a swift end to this long siege.
The young boy commander immediately ordered his men to fiercely follow up their crushing victory in the open plains with a massive, all-out attack on the town itself. Heavy wooden ladders were swiftly brought forward and firmly planted against the towering city walls, and a tidal wave of Arab soldiers swarmed up onto the solid stone fortifications. Once the walls were successfully breached, the battle plunged into a grueling, claustrophobic nightmare.
For 3 agonizing days, brutal hand-to-hand fighting raged relentlessly through the narrow, blood-slaked streets of Debal.
The surviving Rajputs and the Brahmins fought desperately, defending every alleyway and stone courtyard with the cornered fury of doomed men.
At last, the bloody toll became too much to bear, and the Hindus desperately begged for peace, signaling the definitive fall of Debal to the young Arab general. Proud Debal, the wide-open gateway of Sind, now lay entirely at the feet of the Arabs. By all the harsh, unforgiving rules of ancient warfare, Muhammad could have easily sacked the wealthy city and put its remaining inhabitants to the sword.
Instead, the 17-year-old victor displayed a shockingly profound tolerance, treating the defeated Hindus with extraordinary kindness. In a world accustomed to the cruelty of conquerors, he ordered that the grand temple be left completely untouched and the priests be left alone.
Even the Hindu governor of the town, who had previously fought him tooth and nail and now begged for mercy, was astonishingly allowed to continue in his position as governor.
Before eventually moving on from his monumental conquest, Muhammad laid out a dedicated Muslim quarter within the conquered town. Here, amidst the bustling streets of the newly pacified city, he built a masjid. This modest yet historic structure was the very first masjid to ever be built in the vast land of the Hindus, a permanent architectural testament not of bloody conquest, but of a young commander's unprecedented mercy and visionary leadership. Chapter 10. The War of Words. Words are the first weapons drawn in any war, but the arrogant ink of a tyrant is swiftly washed away by the unyielding resolve of the faithful. A clash of swords may decide the fate of a battlefield, but a clash of wills determines the destiny of an empire. The catastrophic fall of Debel sent shockwaves through the heart of Sind, but rather than instilling caution, it ignited a blinding fury within the royal court. When the grim news reached Raja Daha, the proud ruler completely lost his temper. Refusing to accept that a 17-year-old boy had shattered his impenetrable fortress, Daha convinced himself that the Arab victory was a mere fluke. Seething with indignation, he decided to crush the young commander's spirit with a blistering, arrogant letter. The Raja's missive was a masterclass in vanity and thinly veiled terror. He arrogantly wrote that the taking of Debel was no great success and nothing to feel overjoyed about. To save face, he dismissed the conquered fortress as a meaningless town inhabited by mean people, mere merchants and traders, who knew absolutely nothing about the brutal art of war. Daha then turned to explicit threats, weaponizing the blood of the crushed vanguards. He sharply reminded Muhammad that 2 Muslim armies had marched into Sind before him, and both of their commanders had been ruthlessly killed. If the young boy did not withdraw forthwith, Daha promised he would meet the exact same bloody fate. Boasting of his insurmountable military might, the Raja declared that his troops were numberless and armed with the absolute best of weapons. He flaunted his devastating cavalry and his monstrous war elephants, mockingly noting that he did not think the Arabs possessed any such terrifying assets. The haughty scroll was delivered to the Arab encampment, but if Daha had hoped to strike terror into the youthful Arab commander's heart, that hope proved entirely false.
Muhammad bin Qasim sat in his command tent, his expression as cold and unreadable as carved marble.
He read the vain boasts without a flicker of fear.
The young general flatly refused to be cowed down by the Raja's arrogant threats, realizing that Daha possessed absolutely no respect for the Arabs.
It was his absolute duty to forge that respect, or a perpetual, deadly threat would forever hang over the Arab sea lines. Dipping his quill into the dark ink, Muhammad drafted an icy, uncompromising reply that would make the Hindu Raja tremble.
He began by dismantling Daha's material vanity.
He noted that, while the Raja was fiercely proud of his elephants, his horses, his troops, and his weapons, the Arabs put all of their trust entirely in Allah, believing confidently that he would protect them and grant them ultimate victory and honor. The boy commander then laid bare the tyrant's long history of treachery. Muhammad meticulously recounted Daha's past sins, backing the Iranians against the Arabs, actively causing violent risings in Balochistan and Mekran, and dispatching his own troops to fuel the rebellions. Muhammad reminded the Raja that the Muslims had gracefully overlooked all these transgressions, but the final straw was unforgivable. He indicted Daha for the looted ships, pointing out that when requested to punish the robbers and release the captive women and children, the Raja had mockingly told them to deal with it themselves. Finding those very prisoners trapped in the jails of Debel definitively proved that Daha was secretly backing the pirates all along. The young prodigy's pen struck the parchment with the absolute finality of a judge's gavel. Muhammad declared that he had brought these evil deeds to the attention of the Caliphate, who had ordered him to decisively punish the Raja. Muhammad's concluding lines sealed their mutual fate. He commanded Daha to get ready for a final, apocalyptic trial of strength, promising with unbreakable resolve to fight the tyrant to the bitter end, even if it cost him his very life. The war of words had ended, replaced by an unbreakable oath of retribution. There would be no retreat, no surrender, and no compromise. The irresistible force of the Arab vanguard was now set on a direct, catastrophic collision course with the immovable vanity of the King of Sind.